Okay, I've got the time as 1 o'clock, so let's kick off. Okay, well, hello everyone. My name is Katrina Baker and I'm the event organizer at Clare. I would like to welcome you to the SuRF UK framework for assessing the sustainability of soil and groundwater remediation webinar. Our presenters are Jonathan Smith and Paul Bardos, which are representing the Sustainable Remediation Forum for the United Kingdom. I would also like to introduce my project director, Nicola Harries, who will be moderating the question and answer session in approximately 45 minutes' time. Firstly, a couple of housekeeping notices to go through. So instructions to dial into the audio aspects of this webinar are on the title slide, but for those of you who missed them, you must dial into the conference call to hear the speakers talk through the presentation. Secondly, if you have a mobile phone next to or nearby your office telephone, if you could put it on silent or preferably turn it off so that we don't get any interruptions from the signal interference. Talking about interruptions, as those of you who read the reminder email and the title slide will know, all participants have been put on mute. Now, this is a new system that we're trying to keep background noise to a minimum. And can I ask the speakers that when you're not talking, if you could also put your phones on mute as well by pressing # and 6. Right, next slide. Oh no, there we go. So, for those of you who have any experienced any technical problems during the webinar, if possible, could you please raise your hand by clicking on the hand icon, which I believe is located to the right up there, or to the left, sorry. As you're all on mute, I'll be able to contact you and communicate you through the chat function, which is on the right-hand side. So let's just have a look at that. Here's the link to the chat. So basically, we've got the list of all of the participants on the left, and there's a speech bubble which is there as well. If you press on that and look at the bottom, you'll see that there's a blank white box underneath 2. And under 2, you can send a chat message to all, or you can send it to me personally, Katrina Baker, and I'll be able to communicate with you through there if you have any technical problems. If at any point during the webinar your screen freezes, and after a couple of minutes it doesn't look like it's going to come back to life, then the best thing to do is to close down your web browser and join the webinar again. Similarly, if any of you have any flashing bars at the top of your screen, it's probably because you've got a pop-up blocked and you just need to right-click on that bar and allow temporary pop-ups. Right, last but not least, I'll go through we'll just have a look at the feedback as well. At the end of the webinar, or towards the end, we would just like to ask you a couple of multiple choice questions to just gain your feedback on the registration process, the content, and using the SuRF framework going forward. So we'd really appreciate it if you could all stay on just to answer those very brief multiple choice questions. As I've already mentioned on the email communications, this webinar is being recorded live and will be converted into 2 different podcasts, different file formats, and will be available to download from the Clare website free of charge within a week. And I'll send you all an email to notify you about that as well. Right, so that's my part done. Now I'd like to hand you over to Paul Bardos, who will be taking you through the first part of the session.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I should begin with a small apology to the many people who have joined us from outside the UK. The framework that we're going to describe to you will largely describe from a UK context. So if there's any jargon or UK-specific things that you need us to explain or go into in a bit more detail, we can do that in the question and answer session. If you send a speech, chat bubble in to Katrina. So today's presentation is going to last approximately 45 minutes, leaving 15 minutes for questions and answers. This presentation provides an overview of the SuRF UK Sustainable Remediation Framework. It'll be given by myself, Paul Bardas, and by Professor Jonathan Smith from Shell. Together, we're going to cover the following topics. What is SuRF UK? What do we mean by sustainable remediation? The drivers for sustainable remediation. At the end of that segment, I'm going to hand over to Jonathan, who will tell you about the SuRF UK framework in a bit more detail and how its sustainability considerations fit into the existing UK risk-based framework for soil and groundwater. And he'll conclude with a slide that describes the framework in a nutshell. To begin with, we give a brief introduction of ourselves. So, my name is Paul Bardas. I'm the Managing Director of Arthur Environmental Technology, and I have connections with the universities of Nottingham and Reading. For my sins, I was originally a soil microbiologist, but I now have a much wider interest in contaminated land management and waste management, for example. And I've been working in this area since, God help me, the mid-1980s. There's a little list of things that I've been involved with on this slide. I won't go through them. I'll move on to our next presenter, who's Jonathan. Jonathan's a senior hydrogeologist at Shell Global Solutions. He's also a visiting professor at the University of Sheffield. His background is as a contaminant hydrogeologist, and his interests include contaminated land and groundwater risk assessment, risk management, and groundwater surface water interactions. Amongst the many things that he's done, he's been the chairman of SuRF UK and its steering group. He also chairs and takes part in a number of other working groups to do with soil and groundwater issues. For many of us in the UK, he's perhaps been most famous for things he did in his former life at the Environment Agency. For example, the remedial targets methodology, which is called P20, guidance on monitored natural attenuation, and cost-benefit analysis guidance for groundwater remediation. So what is SuRF UK? Well, SuRF UK was set up to support the development of remediation that is better and more explicitly linked to the goals of sustainable development. It is and has always been a collaboration of regulators, industry, academics and consultants, and was established in 2007. It was inspired in large part by a similar network called Sustainable Remediation Forum in the USA. Since SuRF UK began, it's been independently coordinated by Claire, who are hosting this webinar, and its work has been funded by the Homes and Communities Agency with support from SACTA members and in-kind support from a wide range and a large number of public and private sector organisations who've contributed time and effort to its goals via its various open meetings and consultations. Now, SuRF focuses on sustainable remediation at several levels. At a high-level context of land planning, at the level of project design, at the level of selection of remedial technologies and strategies, and at implementation and verification. Now, the framework itself focuses largely on project design and remedy strategy selection, but you'll see as Jonathan goes through the slides how it has a wider relevance as well. This framework, along with a review of indicators that might be important in understanding sustainable remediation performance were the initial goals for the SuRF UK network. These goals have now been met, and SuRF UK has gone on to a second phase, which is to support the improvement of tools for sustainable remediation decision-making. For example, improving indicators. Secondly, collating case studies of sustainable remediation in the UK. Thirdly, linking with related initiatives internationally. And fourthly, looking at providing training tools. One thing is very important to note, and that is that SuRF UK is not developing its own decision support tools, software, and such like. The rationale for SuRF UK is to enable a generic climate that favours the adoption of sustainable remediation, but not to invent its own specific tools and technologies. So it's very much an open shop, an open process. The wide cross-sectoral collaboration that's always been a part of SuRF UK is illustrated by the SuRF UK steering group. So a question we tended to hear at the beginning of the SuRF UK process was this: isn't remediation always sustainable? And I guess until relatively recently, it was assumed that remediation is fundamentally a sustainable activity by many people. And the issue really was only whether one form of remediation was better than another. Clearly, in contaminated land management, the goal in designing and implementing a remediation scheme is to remove or manage the risks that are associated with contaminants in the environment. However, remediation projects can also have negative impacts on the environment. For example, their use of large amounts of energy or natural resources, including water. They can produce wastes that require off-site disposal, atmospheric emissions. They also may have social and economic impacts. For example, changes in road traffic, impacts related with noise and dust. So I think that as we've progressed through the SuRF UK process, this fundamental assumption that remediation is sustainable per se, no matter what, is no longer widely held. And it is clear that in certain circumstances, remediation can cause more detriment than benefit, particularly when the impacts and benefits are viewed widely rather than with a narrow focus on the specific soil or groundwater contaminant targets that an individual may be responsible for managing. I illustrate this point with two recent cases in the UK where detrimental impacts were obvious and extreme. The first is the remediation of a large former steelworks by a local authority. In a recent landmark court case brought to the High Court by a group of residents with birth defects, Corby Borough Council were found negligent in their management of the remediation work, which was essentially an excavation and disposal in landfill off-site. Now, the court case did not prove causality of the remediation for the birth defects, and the individuals involved will have to prove that in subsequent court actions. But the court did decide that the council's remediation was undertaken in a manner that was unacceptable and that could have given rise to birth defects. The second example is the tragic death of a young engineering geologist who died in 2008 while working in an unsupported site investigation trench. Clearly, the health and safety impacts of both of these activities, both of these examples, were severe and probably exceeded the impacts associated with the presence of the original contamination. Okay, we should be moving on to the next slide, which is on sustainable development, but my screen appears to have frozen, Katrina. So I'm going to try and hand over control. Katrina, I'm really sorry. Can you take over control remotely, because I can't do anything here whatsoever. I'll continue the presentation in 1 minute, and I'll assume that if I can't turn the slides, you will.
Okay, Paul, I'll try and take back control now. Sorry about this, ladies and gentlemen. We'll try and get this sorted out as soon as we can. Right, okay, I've taken back control. Let me bring up the presentation again. Okay.
So, Katrina, I'll just say next slide. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's
All
fine.
right. So, to make, apologise for this, everybody. We had no technical glitches in our rehearsal, so I guess we're cursed to have one during the live event. Just to make sure we're all on the same page about sustainable development, SuRF UK has based its work on sustainable development as defined in 1987 by the Brundtland Report. Now, sustainable development includes an environmental element, an economic element, and a social element. You may also hear these described as the 3 pillars of sustainability: people, planet, and profit. Sustainable development thinking has been constantly evolving since 1987, and now there's an increasing interest in concepts like natural, economic, and social assets, with natural assets, for example, encompassing the concept of ecosystem services. And of course, we also have the ideas of strong and weak sustainability. While the SuRF UK framework derives from Brundtland, it also encompasses this evolving thinking, and this can be included in how sustainability is assessed, for example, in the choice of indicators of sustainability and in how they're valued. So next slide.
Okay.
In parallel, there's been an evolution in thinking about how contaminated land should be managed. Early management decisions were often driven by a desire to achieve complete cleanup to background or to stringent multifunctional type limits. Indeed, some would argue that there was often not a clear rationale for the cleanup targets which were imposed, although some prevention of harm was the usual driver, some notion of prevention of harm. By 2002, with the publication of the European Clarinet Project report, the concept of risk-based land management was more generally recognized, in which risk assessment was seen as providing an objective means of establishing remediation goals which both prevented harm and avoided the constraints of complete cleanup. So this is the blue bubble in the middle. Interestingly, the Clarinet Project also foresaw that sustainability considerations would ultimately become an important decision driver in the same way as risks. Today, there are increasing concerns about sustainability issues and an increased understanding that not all remediation is beneficial. For example, if it is over-designed or if its impacts are worse than the problem needing to be solved. So there's a view that the impacts of remediation need to be weighed against its benefits. So we're really now on the right-hand side of this diagram in the green bubble, where the rationale for contaminated land management has moved from one based on complete or multifunctional cleanup through to one based on risk management, and now more recently to one based on risk management and achieving the goals of sustainable development together. Next slide, please, Katrina.
Okay.
The SuRF UK definition recognises this evolving thinking. It has taken some effort and discussion to agree over a number of consultations and open meetings, But the definition that SuRF UK has come up with is that sustainable remediation is the practice of demonstrating in terms of environmental, economic and social indicators that the benefit of undertaking remediation is greater than its impact, and that the optimum remediation solution should be selected through the use of a balanced decision-making process. Now, as I mentioned before, there's a worldwide interest in sustainable remediation, and the definitions that have been developed in the USA by SuRF, in Australia by SuRF UK, and in Europe by Nicole are not substantively different from this SuRF UK definition. Next slide, please. So what are the drivers for the sustainable remediation interest? Well, clearly sustainable development has in itself become a policy driver for developing better environmental management practice. But there are also some specific drivers promoting the sustainable remediation agenda. For example, for industry, the drivers might include corporate social responsibility, business ethics, sustainable procurement, corporate sustainable development policies. And this underpins the interest of SAGTA in SuRF UK. Another group of drivers which you might think are primarily regulatory but are probably cross-sectoral is the need to find appropriate and reasonable solutions. The actual legislative background in the planning and contaminated land regimes and at the European level, which I'll come back to. Within planning, for example, sustainability tests are required in some planning applications and are used in spatial planning. So there's a broad cross-sectoral backing for sustainable remediation in the UK, and there's also a worldwide interest. And I've mentioned some examples already, but others include a SuRF network that's been developed in the Netherlands, a European network called Eurodemo Plus, there's several initiatives in the USA, and also in Canada and Australia, and apparently now in Latin America as well. Next slide, please, Katrina. So we have this drive for sustainable remediation, but equally there are perhaps some fears as well. And three common responses might be, can we use it? What is the point of it? And isn't it all a lot more work? Well, I'm greatly indebted to Richard Boyle for answering these questions for us. The first question is yes. Regulations and guidance are already written in a way that can embrace sustainable development concepts applied to remediation. What is its point? Well, its point is to mitigate unacceptable risks, but in a way that derives the greatest overall benefit. It also helps demonstrate compliance with public and corporate sustainable development policies and commitments. It makes discussions and communications with stakeholders easier. It can strengthen planning applications. And it provides a balanced way to consider economic, social and environmental factors. And we believe that it's not really a lot more work. SuRF UK's view is that a lot of the processes that have been structured in this framework are probably going on already, albeit in a more informal way. So we anticipate that most sustainability assessments are likely to be straightforward. Next slide, please, Katrina. So these are the points of linkage to European Union legislative context. The first is the draft EU SuRF Framework Directive. The last text of this in 2010, for example, said, when deciding on remediation action, Member States shall give due consideration to social, economic and environmental impacts, cost effectiveness and technical feasibility of the actions envisaged. Now, currently this is still a draft directive, but discussions to support it are still going on, so it is still a directive that might appear in the not-too-distant future. The EU Water Framework Directive, of course, already exists, and that is also explicit in its support for sustainable solutions. Next slide, please, Katrina. Briefly, for the UK legislative context, we draw your attention to Planning Policy Statements 1 and 23, the Environment Act, Sections 4 and Section 39, and Part 2A of the 1990 Environmental Protection Act. So at this point, Jonathan is going to take over the presentation. Thank you very much for your attention so far, and I'm sorry for the technical glitch in the middle of my chat.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Katrina, will you pass control to me, or do you want to continue in this mode?
No, I'm going to make you the presenter now. And can I just remind everyone as well that if you have any questions to ask the presenters, then you can send them through now. You don't have to wait until the 15-minute question and answer session at the end. Please use the chat facility, which again is to the right-hand side of the list of participants. You've got a speech bubble box there, and at the bottom you'll see a plain white box, and you can send the questions to either all, so all of the participants can see your question, or you can send it to the Q&A group. And if you have a technical query, then just send it through to me personally. But once again, just please send your questions through as and when you have them. And over to you, Jonathan.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, turning now to the SuRF UK framework itself. We'll start with the key principles underpinning the framework, then move to the process of sustainable remediation appraisal and decision making, and describe how sustainability can be assessed and how it can be used to support decision making in a UK regulatory context. SuRF UK has identified a number of key principles that are associated with sustainable remediation and which should be considered by practitioners in the design, implementation and reporting of sustainable remediation schemes. The balancing of environmental, social and economic costs and benefits in identifying the optimum remediation solution needs to be carried out while complying with the key principles shown on the screen. These key principles are, firstly, protection of human health and the wider environment. Remediation, and in the UK context we mean site-specific risk management, should remove unacceptable risks to human health and protect the wider environment both now and into the future for the agreed land use. Failure to achieve this criteria results in ineffective remediation, never mind sustainable remediation. Principle 2, safe working practices. Clearly, remediation work should be safe, both for workers and for neighbours and local communities nearby. Principle 3, consistent, clear and reproducible evidence-based decision making. Sustainable risk-based decisions are made having regard to environmental, social and economic factors and consider both current and likely future implications. The process relies on data, evidence and stakeholder views. And the appraisal processes and tools input data and assumptions, and the results should be clear and reproducible. Fourthly, record keeping and transparent reporting. Decisions, including the assumptions and supporting data used to reach them, should be documented in a clear and easily understood format in order to demonstrate to interested parties that a sustainable, or otherwise, if that's the solution, has been adopted. Principle 5 relates to good governance and stakeholder involvement, insofar as remediation decisions should be made having regard to the views of relevant stakeholders and following the process within which they can participate if they wish. And final principle, principle 6, decisions should be made on the basis of sound science, relevant and accurate data, and clearly explained assumptions, uncertainties and professional judgment. This will ensure that decisions are based on the best available information and are justifiable. In certain projects, it is recognised that non-optimum remediation solutions may be made because other factors are more influential in the decision-making process. Considering regulatory implications and recording why such a decision was taken should be a minimum requirement for any decision-making process. Onto the framework itself. This figure summarises the overall process of considering sustainability in remediation project planning and wider regeneration activities. The SuRF UK framework recognises two fundamental stages at which sustainability can be considered. Stage A on the left-hand side of the flowchart, which is about planning and project design, and Stage B to the right, the remediation selection and implementation stage. The framework also recognises a clear break point between stages A and B. The opportunity to revisit a decision once the design milestone has passed and we cross that dashed line is often limited, so those parties involved only in the latter stages of a project, such as remediation contractors, often have only a limited ability to influence the sustainability of the overall wider project. Looking to Stage A on the left, within Stage A, that is the project design, there is an opportunity in task A there to embed a sustainable remediation strategy into the wider project plan or design. This stage is considered a relatively flexible stage, permitting several design iterations in an effort to integrate optimum remediation strategy into the wider project. In many respects, the goal is to take account of remediation issues alongside other relevant criteria at the higher level project planning stage to ensure that the optimum remediation strategy is adopted. Typically, completion of Stage A delivers an agreed and final project design or plan. Once the broader project frame is established and we cross the dashed line into Stage B, the main influence that can be achieved by sustainable remediation assessment is to identify the optimum remediation technique that will facilitate delivery of that project design or plan, and that is Stage B. This stage is where the core aspects, so-called core aspects of remediation project are set, as described in the Environment Agency's guidance on environmental merit of remediation. And the task is to evaluate the sustainability criteria for different remediation options that are capable of delivering the remediation strategy developed previously. A second, more detailed flowchart is presented in the framework report, which shows where sustainability reporting might be appropriate and how to document decisions that, for whatever reason, use less than optimum solutions. It is our view that the greatest sustainability wins are likely to be generated at Stage A. Early consideration of remediation issues in project design and integration of the remedial strategy into wider project goals is most likely to ensure the most sustainable outcome. In this next slide, I show how the framework is sufficiently flexible that it can be applied to various decision-making scenarios within a project or property lifecycle and to different sizes of project or site. The slide illustrates how it can be applied to different remediation scenarios by using one or both stages of the framework. Furthermore, Stage A can be split down into stages A1 and A2 within a brownfield land assessment that is taken through design stages, firstly at local planning scale, or local scale planning, and then at site-specific level. A number of scenarios are presented on the slide, which I shall describe in order, working from the top. So looking at the top row, which relates to local planning, in the UK, the town and country planning process develops local spatial plans, which formally allocate land for different uses, employment, residential, retail, and so on. This process is currently being amended by the coalition government, who have abolished regional spatial strategies at regional level and have also removed central targets. Nevertheless, sustainable development is still a core principle of this process. Indeed, it is a statutory requirement that plans contribute to sustainable development. The local development documents have a positive role to play in steering development onto appropriate previously developed land, some of which may be affected by contamination, and to protect greenfield sites from avoidable development. Local development documents are the most powerful place to improve the sustainability of a site and should include policies and proposals for dealing with remediation requirements as one of the factors that can be considered when developing the preferred mosaic of land uses and site-specific allocation. This is essentially a Stage A of the SuRF UK framework process, as shown in the first row of this figure. It's not linked to Stage B remediation implementation, since it is exclusively a decision-making process at local planning level, and the final milestone is a local development document. The potential contribution that a sustainable remediation assessment can make in spatial planning decisions, by considering that contamination may be so great as to effectively preclude the development of some sites for particularly sensitive uses. Moving down to the second row, we come to brownfield redevelopment, where land is changing use. This is shown on the second row, and we identify stages A1, A2, and B as we move across. A parcel of land for development may be subject to two phases of design. Firstly, at local scale planning, with a land use determination, and then at site-specific level, arguably with a breakpoint between the two. And this concept is presented here as two stages, A1 and A2. However, an alternative, perhaps more common option in practice for brownfield land is that the local plan is already set and only the site-specific design issues will be considered. Site-specific design examples of sustainability considerations might include matching land use with ground conditions, be that contamination or geotechnical issues. For example, locating the most vulnerable receptors and land uses away from the most contaminated areas, or considering the feasibility of locating basement parking within ground that requires intervention, thereby avoiding excavating clean soils to create basements while at the same time remediating other soils in situ. In terms of any brownfield development scenario, Stage A design commonly links directly to Stage B implementation, with the transition being the granting of a detailed planning permission, whereafter it is impossible to change the layout of the site without submitting a new planning application, which can obviously be a lengthy and costly exercise without any guarantees of success. In the third row, we're dealing with land which needs remediation but is going to continue in its current use, so it's operational land with no proposed change of use. And in this instance, the remediation works invariably drive the sustainability of the overall project because the remediation work is the entire project, essentially. This scenario is shown here as two stages, A and B, and in this case, establishing a sustainable remediation strategy to embed within the plan or project design, and then agreeing the overall project design are part of the same milestone. Remediation implementation, and now we're down to the bottom row, stage B only. In many circumstances, a practitioner such as a remediation contractor does not have an opportunity to influence the design work. They may only be asked to implement a selected remedial strategy in order to deliver the design requirements. And this represents the stage B process within the SuRF UK framework, as shown at the bottom of this figure. At this stage, the remediation options appraisal can only seek to influence the technologies or techniques used to achieve risk-based remedial objectives and also optimize the overall benefit provided by the operation of those remediation. The sustainability assessment would generally be undertaken as part of a remediation options appraisal and reported with a remediation action plan. On to slide 24 there. The process of undertaking a sustainability appraisal includes a number of steps and activities which are summarised here. Be clear at the outset why you are undertaking a sustainability appraisal. What decisions are you trying to inform, and what options and indicators are being considered to influence or to inform that overall process. Understand which stakeholders have input into the process, identify them and talk to them, and make sure that all parties are clear on the objectives and process from the outset. If they don't accept the rules of the game at the beginning, they're unlikely to accept its results at the end. And then we get down to setting the assessment boundaries. So what is the project scope? And this might include a number of issues, including the spatial extent of the analysis. Are we limiting our assessment to activities within the remediation site boundary, or to the site activities plus transport to and from the site? Or are regional or even global impacts included, such as the impacts from carbon dioxide emissions? And it might include temporal considerations, so think of the timescales. What are the time period over which you're evaluating the impacts and the benefits? The duration of the remediation works, perhaps a human generation if we're interested in intergenerational equity issues, the lifetime of institutions, be they companies or regulators, or other planning horizons or some longer temporal timescale. In terms of sustainability indicators, which sustainability criteria are we going to apply within our appraisal process? What sustainability appraisal method are we going to apply? So how are we actually going to do the assessment? And who's going to do it and when? And finally, interpreting the results and understanding the sensitivity of the outcome to different input assumptions. Sustainable remediation assessment is generally based on an evaluation of the performance of different remediation options against a list of sustainability indicators such as those presented in this table. This preliminary list of 18 indicator categories is based on a review of the international literature on sustainability appraisals, which is presented in a report that's available on the CLARE website, and to which I'll give a link later. The table presents an equal number of criteria under each of the three pillars of sustainability: environment, society and economy. And this list of 18 sustainability indicator categories is indicative of the range of issues that may be relevant and is provided to help assessors identify the most critical issues to evaluate further in the project. It is possible that additional factors may warrant consideration, and stakeholder consultation may help to identify those. Perhaps more commonly, though, it will be agreed by the assessors that not all of the 18 categories are relevant to a project, are not of critical concern, and do not warrant analysis. We believe that for most remediation projects, the most relevant factors are included in these lists, but I would emphasise that we see this list of categories, and they're categories not metrics, as a starting point for assessment, and if it is possible to reduce the list from 18 down to 12 or 8 or 3 indicators, which are relevant to the project being considered, most critical in terms of sustainability, and vary between the remediation options being evaluated, then using a smaller number of criteria will make the appraisal process more straightforward. Onto the flowchart here, we show the tiered approach that SuRF UK recommends for sustainability appraisal. Entering at the top left of the figure, we start by reviewing the criteria for sustainability appraisal as described previously. Unless all the participant stakeholders have agreed on the rules of the game at the outset, they're unlikely to accept the results at the end. Once scope is agreed, an appraisal can be undertaken using one of a number of methods, from simple qualitative approaches, perhaps no more than a round-table conversation about sustainability implications of identified remedial strategies or options, through semi-quantitative approaches, perhaps including multi-criteria analysis, through to more complex quantitative cost-benefit or life cycle analyses. The complexity of the evaluation should be proportionate to the scale of the project, and in general, and in line with the tiered risk assessment approach that we're all familiar with, the simplest form of appraisal that produces a robust management decision should normally be used. We do not see any particular method being more or less valid than any other. The key for us, as on the SuRF UK steering board, is that a consistent framework is adopted, and that whichever method is used, the input data are agreed by stakeholders, complete and auditable, and the output is recorded and the actions taken forward, as shown in the final box in this flowchart. There may be different reasons for and benefits of undertaking an appraisal at different tiers. This slide shows some of those issues. So in terms of the qualitative appraisal, the WLA may be better able to cope with a broader scope of issues, including indicators that might be ranked against one another, but perhaps can't be so easily monetized or valued. It may get better input from lay participants and stakeholders if they are part of the project, and is likely to be easier to complete and less expensive. In contrast, quantitative appraisals may be seen by some as providing more certain or hard data, and financial output may be required for corporate reporting and decision making. However, quantitative appraisals are often more limited in scope and are more resource and time consuming to complete. So how does sustainability align with UK good practice on land contamination management? Well, in this next slide, we show a screenshot from CLR 11. Paul's already described how both EU and UK legislation and regulations make various requirements for, or at least allow, sustainability considerations in remediation decision making. And moving past the regulations, I show here the screenshot from CLR 11, the model procedures for the management of land contamination. And for the benefit of those on the webinar who are not working in the UK, CLR 11 is the recommended framework by which most land contamination in the UK should be evaluated and any unacceptable risks managed. It's the central framework on which more detailed characterisation, risk assessments and management guidance provide support. And there are already numerous hooks to sustainability in CLR 11. We see the SuRF UK framework sitting underneath CLR 11 and supplementing the existing risk-based assessment and management process. Sustainable remediation is not a new paradigm that replaces risk management and risk assessment, rather an improvement that allows the best solution to be identified and applied in order to manage risks effectively, safely, and without undue environmental, social, or economic impacts. Returning to this slide, which Paul put a version of earlier on, I think we have shown that the SuRF UK framework has provided for the first time a framework that allows assessors to incorporate sustainability criteria into risk-based contaminated land assessment and management. The framework applies to a range of situations in the UK, and as Paul's already pointed out, others overseas are busy developing similar frameworks that complement legislation in other countries. We stated in the opening slides that the objectives for the SuRF UK project included that the framework was effective, practical, and gained regulatory acceptance. And we're really pleased to say that both DEFRA and the CLG, the Welsh Assembly, the Homes and Communities Agency, and the Environment Agencies for England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland have signed a forward to the framework commending its use. Clearly, it needs to be applied within a relevant regulatory context, and particularly within any constraints that may be laid down in legislation. And we see these legislative requirements as examples of the project boundaries within which a sustainability appraisal may be completed. Looking to the future, we see a likely increased focus on sustainability issues in emerging and developing legislation. The recent consultation on revised statutory guidance for Part 2A in England and Wales emphasised sustainability in a number of places. It currently remains to be seen what changes will be implemented following the consultation, but we believe the SuRF UK framework can be used to make better, more sustainable decisions about the way to manage any unacceptable risks. A similar process is anticipated in Scotland, and as previously mentioned, the draft Soil Framework Directive is not quite dead yet, and in its previous incarnations was heavily focused on sustainable remediation. So I'd like to draw towards a conclusion by summarising the framework. The SuRF UK framework is the first to set out what sustainable remediation is and how you might go about appraising the sustainability of different remedial strategies and techniques for a given project. We've taken advice and contribution from many stakeholders in our industry and beyond, both during our open forum workshops and report consultation process, and we believe that it presents a widely accepted approach to this topic. In particular, we are pleased to have the commendation from the key UK regulators in the forward to the document, though we, of course, do not claim this report represents any official policy or position on our behalf. The framework itself complements the existing sustainable development goals of the planning system and helps assessors to identify where sustainability can be made, provides a framework that all stakeholders can use as common accepted ground on which to build legally compliant appraisals regarding remediation sustainability, can be used to help assessors minimise environmental, social and economic impacts by identifying the optimum overall balance, facilitates communication, and is broad in scope and allows appraisals that are proportionate to the size of the project through a tiered process. Ultimately, we hope that it will bring about better, more sustainable remediation in the UK and beyond. And to aid that implementation, we're in the process of developing a series of case studies that illustrate how sustainable remediation can be applied for real. For those that are interested in further detail, there are two reports really available on the CLARE website on the link shown at the top of this slide. The SuRF UK Framework Report, which we've described, and a review of published sustainability indicator sets that formed part of the process of deriving our list of 18 sustainability indicator categories. In addition, the website includes a recent peer-reviewed journal paper by the authors of the framework, which describes its application. In terms of the indicator categories, on the website you'll also find further explanation of what each of these indicator categories includes. Working without this detail, it is easy to either exclude issues or double count under multiple categories. So we've offered this to aid consideration of what indicators might include or equally important, exclude. And with that, I'll draw to a close and hand control back to Katrina and Nicola to moderate any questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's Nicola Harris here. I can see from the chat line there are a number of questions come in. We've got 10 minutes for questions. I'll go in time order, just for the people who were emailing earlier. The gentleman at Dirk, just trying to find, he was asking, with regard to SuRF's definition of sustainable remediation, demonstrating benefits to outweigh detriments, how do we deal with the potential indefinite time horizon of the benefits? Could I ask Paul to make a comment on this? And if Jonathan wants to chip in afterwards.
Can you hear me okay, Nicola?
Yep.
I thought that was a really good question and actually quite a difficult question. I think that the way that we would tackle that in an assessment is really in terms of how we define the boundaries of the assessment. For example, some benefits, for example, climate change benefits, may have quite a long time horizon, whereas other benefits or impacts such as dust or traffic might be related purely to the period of remediation works. So I think ideally, when you're making the sustainability assessment, you should look at the longest time horizon, but it probably makes sense for you to categorize or flag the indicators that you're using in some way so that you can tell which ones are long-term and which ones are short-term, and use that perhaps as a way of determining what the short-term effects of a project are, as well as its long-term effects. I know that's not a complete answer to your question, but that's the kind of workaround we would have in the SuRF UK framework. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. Jonathan, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I mean, if you're going to quantitative methods, then I think Paul Nathaniel on the chat has given one answer as well, which is common use of net present value approaches, but that, obviously that only really applies for monetized quantitative approaches. So you could include a discount factor or a discount rate in that assessment.
Okay. Thank you for that. I know there are a lot of questions coming through, but I just want to cherry pick a few of them. One comment that Barry Croft has made is, won't we need legislation on sustainable remediation before folk will take it seriously? Do you want to make a comment to that, Jonathan?
Yeah, I'll come back on that. I mean, working for an industrial organisation, we have corporate policies in relation to how we'll undertake our business, which takes or makes statements in relation to sustainable development, and I guess that's why I and other SAGTA members are involved with SuRF UK without there being any legislative driver, because we want to act responsibly, and at the moment we don't have a framework by which we can do sustainability appraisals and be sure that we're doing it in a manner which is acceptable to regulators and other stakeholders. So, yeah, there may be some parties out there who won't act unless there's legislation in place that requires them to do so, but I don't think that's the case for everyone, and certainly not for a good number of the SAGTA members who we kind of represent on the steering board.
Thank you. There's a question from Andrew Barton saying, how many remediation projects have been undertaken following the framework to date? Well, I can answer that, Andrew. One of the key questions that you're going to be asked is, are there any examples being undertaken, or is anyone planning to use the framework? But within the steering group, I would say there's probably half a dozen projects that we are aware of that are using the framework, and hopefully as they start feeding through, we know there's one from the agency that has actually followed the framework retrospectively to start with, but we will be issuing some case studies so people will see how the framework has been used and how flexible it is. So they are coming through, and as soon as we do have them, we will be uploading them on the SuRF website. So one of the questions is asking for more case studies as well. Another question from Craig Smith to all This would appear to currently only be applicable to those clients procuring remediation who've got a vested interest in additional time and costs, suggesting that it would increase remediation costs and increase the total time frame. Are we in danger of pushing clients, particularly time-conscious ones, developers, away from remediation works? Do either of the speakers want to comment on that?
I don't think we are. Yeah, I don't think we are. I think we're trying to find or trying to identify what the optimum remedial strategy and then technology or technique is. If there are other drivers which ultimately are deemed more important by the company or by the regulator or whoever else is important in the process, then non-optimum decisions may be taken, but the point for us is explain why that decision is taken and written down. So I don't think we're being driven towards specific time horizons, but it's certainly not our intention.
Right.
I'll add to that we're not introducing a new step. We're introducing something that is already, for example, in the model procedures, which is looking at wider considerations. We're just trying to provide a more explicit framework for people to do that. And as Jonathan's pointed out, for particular reasons, a regulator or a company may decide to opt for a particular approach to a project or to remediation work. And I think in that case, what the framework asks is that the rationale for that is documented so that if people want to review the decision in the future, they know why it was taken.
Okay, I'm conscious of the time, and it was for a 1-hour webinar. I will hand over to Katrina very quickly to finish off. What I would ask you, as this is our first one, to please fill in your polling questions. So over to you, Katrina.
Okay, thank you, Nicola. Yep, I've done 3 out of 4 polling questions. So the one that's currently on the screen at the moment is, have you got a site which you would like to put forward as a case study? We've got quite a few votes that have come in so far, which is fantastic on the positive side. I'm going to end that poll now, and our last question is really just to find out about doing another SuRF webinar, which I'm going to do now, just to find out from you guys whether you'd be interested in a follow-up webinar focusing on case studies specifically. So please let us know if that's something that you would be interested in, and following the feedback, we'll either put something in the diary or not. But as of today for the current SuRF webinar, I'd like to thank very much the time and the content to Professor Jonathan Smith and also Professor Paul Bardos on behalf of the SuRF UK forum, and I'd like to thank all of the participants for joining us today. We had a fantastic number, over 170 dialed in, which I think you agree is very great. What we will be doing, as I mentioned at the beginning, is that this webinar has been recorded, so we will be converting it into 2 different file formats for a podcast, one which will be available for Apple products and the other which will be in a generic video podcast format. So that should be on the Claire website to download within a week, and I'll send you all an email so that you can download that. And yeah, you can watch it in your own time on your computer or on your Android phone or on your BlackBerry or however you wish, but it will be there for your reference. And you'll hear all of the conference call, and you'll be able to see the presentation slides as well. So I'd like to say again, thank you very much to the speakers, and that's the end of the webinar. Thank you to everyone, and if you'd like to sign out and disconnect from the webinar, and we hope to join you again for maybe the next SuRF webinar, certainly the Claire one. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon. Goodbye.
Paul, Nicola, are you still on the line?
No, Jonathan, they've left.
Oh, have they? Okay. Did you
I
want to...
Yes, I'll send an
Do you
email
want
now.
to set up a new call rather than if there's anyone else still on here?
There are some yet, so I'll send an email and ask them to do a quick debrief.
Yep. Okay. Cheers.